Captain Robert Hayes was the Air Force's most decorated combat pilot until a controversial landing decision cost 15 lives. Court-martialed, stripped of command, and relegated to flying commercial passenger planes, Hayes became known as the Broken Pilot, a once elite aviator destroyed by a single catastrophic judgment call. 3 years into his humiliating civilian exile, Hayes was piloting Transglobal Flight 257 over the North Atlantic when an unprecedented mechanical failure shut down all 4 engines at 40,000 feet. As the massive airliner began its deadly descent with 347 passengers aboard, the air traffic controller's voice cracked over the radio. Transglobal 257, prepare for water landing. What happened next would force the entire aviation industry to rewrite their emergency protocols, as the pilot they had once condemned executed the most extraordinary emergency maneuver in commercial aviation history. Transglobal Airlines Terminal, JFK International Airport, present-day Captain Hayes. I'm First Officer Daniel Chen. I'll be your co-pilot for Flight 257 to London. Robert Hayes nodded curtly, barely glancing up from the flight manifest. Pre-flight checklist completed. Yes, sir. Weather reports updated. Fuel calculations verified. Maintenance sign-offs complete. Chen replied with the nervous efficiency of someone who had meticulously prepared for an uncomfortable encounter. Hayes noticed the tension, but chose to ignore it. After 3 years flying commercial routes, he had grown accustomed to the sidelong glances, whispered comments, and uncomfortable co-pilots. Once, he had commanded elite Air Force combat squadrons. Now, he was the broken pilot, the disgraced military aviator, whose career had crashed as spectacularly as the transport aircraft he had attempted to land during that ill-fated training exercise. Let's proceed with the walk-around, Hayes said, closing the manifest and tucking it into his impeccably maintained flight case. As they moved through the terminal toward the jetway, Hayes caught the reflection of himself in a window. The crisp Transglobal uniform, a poor substitute for the Air Force regalia he had once worn with pride. At 44, his physique remained military precise, his appearance regulation perfect, as if maintaining these external standards could somehow compensate for his shattered professional reputation. In the reflective surface, he also noticed the New York Times headline on a nearby newsstand: Aviation Safety Board reopens investigation into Riverside disaster. The timing wasn't coincidental. Today marked exactly 3 years since the court-martial that had ended his military career. Captain, Chen ventured, as they approached the aircraft. I wanted to say, I requested this assignment. I studied your combat flight record at the academy. Hayes paused, surprised by the comment. Few co-pilots specifically asked to fly with him these days. That was another lifetime. First Officer, 15 combat missions over Kandahar, the emergency landing at Bagram, under enemy fire. With respect, sir, what happened at Riverside doesn't erase that record. Hayes felt a familiar tension in his jaw. In my experience, First Officer Chen, one mistake can indeed erase everything else. Now, shall we focus on today's flight? The pre-flight inspection proceeded with professional efficiency. Hayes approached every commercial flight with the same meticulous attention he had once given combat missions, perhaps even more so now, with the weight of his past failure constantly pressing upon him. Transglobal Flight 257 was a standard transatlantic route, New York to London Heathrow, 347 passengers, aboard a Boeing 777-300ER. Hayes had flown this route dozens of times since joining the commercial carrier. It was about as routine as aviation got, which made it all the more ironic that this particular flight would soon become anything but routine. As passengers boarded, Hayes completed his final systems checks in the cockpit, running through the procedures that had become second nature over thousands of flight hours. The aircraft was in excellent condition, the weather forecasts favorable, with only minor turbulence expected near the midpoint of their journey. Flight 257. This is JFK Ground Control. You are cleared to push back from Gate 14, came the controller's voice over the radio. Roger. Ground Control. Flight 257 commencing pushback. Hayes responded, initiating the first step in what should have been a perfectly ordinary 7-hour flight. Neither he nor anyone else involved could have predicted that within 4 hours, every emergency protocol in commercial aviation would be put to the ultimate test. 37,000 feet above the North Atlantic, 2:17 a.m. Eastern Time, the first 3 hours and 22 minutes of Flight 257 had been textbook routine. Most passengers were asleep, the aircraft cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet, approximately 780 miles northeast of Newfoundland. Hayes had just completed the standard mid-flight systems check when First Officer Chen noticed something unusual. "Captain, I'm seeing fluctuations in the fuel pressure for Engine 4, Chen reported, indicating the rightmost engine display. Hayes leaned forward, studying the readings with focused attention. The fluctuation was minor but irregular, not necessarily alarming, but worthy of investigation. Monitor and log it. Could be sensor variance. How long has it been fluctuating? Just started, about 2 minutes ago. Within operational parameters, but the pattern is unusual." Hayes was about to respond when a second anomaly appeared, this time on Engine 2. "Now we have pressure variance on Engine 2 as well," he noted, his tone still professional, but with a new edge of concern. Multiple simultaneous irregularities significantly reduced the likelihood of a simple sensor malfunction. Before either pilot could investigate further, a cascade of events unfolded with devastating speed. A master caution alert illuminated as Engine 4's pressure dropped precipitously. Within seconds, Engine 2 followed the same pattern. Transglobal 257. This is Gander Oceanic Control. We're showing anomalous data from your aircraft. Please confirm status, came the air traffic controller's voice. Gander Control, this is Transglobal 257. Hayes responded, while simultaneously working through emergency procedures. We have caution indicators on engines 2 and 4, implementing standard troubleshooting protocols. Chen's voice took on an edge of alarm. "Captain, Engine 4 is now showing complete pressure loss." Hayes had just reached for the engine restart protocol when the unthinkable happened. The remaining engines began displaying the same pressure fluctuations. Within 17 seconds, all 4 engines had failed, and the massive Boeing 777 had become effectively a 200-ton glider, 37,000 feet above the open ocean. Gander Control, Transglobal 257, declaring emergency. Hayes stated, with remarkable calm, "We have lost all 4 engines. Repeat, all 4 engines non-operational. Beginning emergency restart procedures." The air traffic controller's response betrayed the gravity of the situation. Such a complete failure was virtually unprecedented in modern commercial aviation. Transglobal 257, understood. Emergency services being notified. Nearest diversion is St. John's and John's, Newfoundland, approximately 780 miles southwest of your position. Hayes processed this information with the rapid calculation of an experienced combat pilot. Without engine power, the 777 could glide approximately 40 miles for every 5,000 feet of altitude. Even starting from 37,000 feet, they would fall catastrophically short of any land-based runway. First officer, priority checklist, Hayes directed, his military training taking over. Emergency restart sequence, all engines, auxiliary power unit activation. Maintain optimal glide speed and trim for maximum range. As Chen worked through the restart procedures with trembling hands, Hayes made a series of rapid calculations and decisions. Each passing second, without engine power, increased the inevitability of an open ocean ditching. Among the most dangerous emergency landings possible, 3 restart attempts on each engine failed to produce results. The auxiliary power unit activated successfully, maintaining essential electrical systems, but could do nothing to restore propulsion. Whatever had affected the engines appeared to be systemic and catastrophic. In the passenger cabin, the sudden descent had awakened most travelers. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies, but never expecting one of this magnitude, moved through the cabin, attempting to maintain calm, while preparing for what was beginning to seem inevitable. "Captain," Chen said, his voice now steady, with the focus that extreme danger sometimes produces, "all restart attempts unsuccessful. Fuel pressure indicators, showing plenty of fuel, but no pressure to engines. It's as if the fuel isn't reaching the combustion chambers at all." Hayes nodded grimly. Potential common mode failure in the fuel delivery system. His mind raced through his extensive training, both military and civilian. "We need to consider alternative approaches." As the aircraft continued its controlled but inexorable descent, Hayes made a decision that would later be studied in aviation schools worldwide. Rather than continuing with standard protocols that were clearly failing, he would attempt something that existed only in theoretical emergency procedures. "First officer, take control and maintain optimal glide speed," Hayes directed. "I'm going to attempt a manual override of the fuel delivery system." Chen looked stunned. "Captain, that's not in any procedure I've studied." "No, it's not," Hayes agreed, already moving to access the maintenance computer. "But I've seen something similar during a combat mission over Afghanistan. Different aircraft, similar principle." What Hayes didn't add was that the procedure he was attempting had been developed for military aircraft under extreme combat conditions, never intended for commercial aviation, and certainly never tested on a Boeing 777. But with 347 lives at stake, and the ocean surface drawing closer with each passing minute, conventional options had been exhausted. 31,000 feet above the North Atlantic, 2:26 a.m. Eastern Time, Gander Control, Transglobal, 257, maintaining controlled descent through 31,000 feet, standard restart protocols, unsuccessful, implementing alternative measures, Hayes reported, his voice betraying none of the tension evident on his face. The controller's response was measured, but realistic. Transglobal 257, understood. Be advised, nearest vessel is the container ship Nordic Voyager, approximately 127 miles from your projected ditching point. Coast Guard assets being dispatched, but earliest arrival would be 3 hours post-ditching. Translation: if they hit the water, survival would depend entirely on their own actions. In the frigid North Atlantic, with night conditions and high seas, a successful ditching was itself improbable. Survival, until rescue arrived, would be even less likely. Hayes acknowledged the information while continuing his unorthodox approach to their predicament. Having removed a rarely accessed maintenance panel beneath the cockpit floor, he was now bypassing the aircraft's computerized fuel management system. A procedure so far outside standard protocols that it wasn't even covered in emergency training. Sir, Chen said, maintaining the aircraft's optimal glide path. We've dropped below 30,000 feet. At current descent rate, we have approximately 47 minutes before water contact. Hayes nodded, without looking up. Understood. Inform cabin crew to prepare for potential ditching, but hold on final preparations. The procedure Hayes was attempting drew on his specialized knowledge from military aviation, specifically a technique developed for the C-17 Globemaster when under enemy fire. Though the systems were different, the fundamental principle was similar, creating a manual pathway for fuel delivery when computerized systems failed. Transglobal 257, Gander Control. We have manufacturer technical team conferenced in. They're requesting details on your alternative measures, the controller relayed. Hayes didn't pause in his work, attempting manual override of the computerized fuel delivery system to establish direct flow path to engine igniters. There was a notable pause before the controller responded. Transglobal 257, manufacturer advises this procedure is not approved and could potentially worsen the situation. Acknowledged. Gander Control. Hayes replied calmly. Please inform manufacturer that standard procedures have been exhausted and current situation can't get substantially worse than 4 failed engines over open ocean. This last comment betrayed the first hint of Hayes' military background, the dark humor and blunt assessment, typical of combat aviators, but rarely heard in commercial flight communications. As Hayes continued his methodical work, rerouting electrical connections and bypassing safety interlocks, Chen maintained the aircraft's glide, optimizing their limited range. The young first officer occasionally glanced at his captain's unorthodox activities with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Captain, we're passing through 25,000 feet, Chen reported. Cabin crew reports passengers are relatively calm but aware of the severity of the situation. Hayes nodded, his focus unwavering. Almost there. This bypass should. His words were interrupted by a sudden change in the aircraft's ambient noise, a subtle vibration, followed by an uneven whine from the rightmost engine. Engine 4 showing ignition attempt, Chen exclaimed, hope evident in his voice. The engine parameters fluctuated wildly on the display, far outside normal operational ranges, but showing signs of combustion. It wasn't a stable restart, but it was the first positive development since the crisis began. Partial compression in engine 4, Hayes confirmed, immediately adjusting his makeshift bypass system. Not enough for sustained thrust, but proves the concept. The computerized fuel management system must have suffered a catastrophic software failure. This manual pathway is bypassing it entirely. For the next 11 minutes, Hayes refined his improvised system, applying his unique combination of combat experience and technical knowledge to coax the engines back to life. Engine 4 stabilized first, providing approximately 30% of normal thrust, insufficient for level flight, but enough to significantly reduce their descent rate. Transglobal 257, we're showing possible engine function on your aircraft. Please confirm status. Gander Control requested, the controller's voice betraying surprise. Gander Control, Transglobal 257, confirmed partial restoration of engine 4 through manual bypass. Attempting same procedure on remaining engines, Hayes responded, already working to replicate his success. Within 17 minutes, Hayes had established manual fuel flow to 3 of the 4 engines, each operating well below normal efficiency, but collectively providing enough thrust to maintain altitude. The immediate threat of ocean ditching had been averted, but they were still in a precarious situation, operating an aircraft in a configuration never envisioned by its designers. Captain, we're holding at 19,700 feet, with 3 engines at partial power, Chen reported, his earlier skepticism replaced with undisguised admiration. Nearest viable runway is now within our potential range. Hayes nodded, allowing himself the first moment of cautious optimism. Calculate fuel consumption at current power settings. We need to determine if we can reach St. John's or if we need to consider alternatives. As Chen performed the calculations, Hayes contacted Gander Control to update their situation. The response from the ground revealed how extraordinary their recovery had been. Transglobal 257, be advised, manufacturer technical team is requesting detailed documentation of your bypass procedure. They're indicating this situation was considered theoretically unsurvivable. Hayes permitted himself a grim smile. Tell them the theory needs revision. We'll provide full documentation after we've successfully landed. St. John's International Airport, Newfoundland, 3:41 a.m. local time. Transglobal 257, St. John's approach. We show you at 15 miles out. Be advised, current conditions include gusting crosswinds at 28 knots, visibility 3/4 of a mile in snow, runway possibly contaminated with ice. Recommend divert to alternate if possible. Hayes processed this information with the calm assessment of someone who had faced far worse conditions under enemy fire. St. John's approach, negative on divert. Our engine configuration is marginally stable at best. We need to get this aircraft on the ground at the earliest opportunity. The approach controller's voice betrayed concern. Understood. Transglobal 257. You are cleared for ILS approach runway 11. Emergency services in position. Be advised, manufacturer representatives are expressing concern about structural integrity given your unconventional engine operation. Acknowledged. Hayes replied simply, focusing on the complex task before him. The situation would have been challenging for any pilot under ideal conditions. With 3 engines operating at unpredictable thrust levels, asymmetric power causing constant yaw, and systems operating well outside designed parameters, it demanded a level of airmanship rarely required in commercial aviation. First officer, I'll take primary control for the approach and landing, Hayes directed. I need you to monitor engine performance and advise of any changes immediately. Chen nodded, understanding that the next 15 minutes would require skill beyond his experience level. Yes, Captain. I'll call out any power fluctuations. Hayes began the approach with a precision born from thousands of hours of flying in combat conditions. The aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs, the asymmetric thrust requiring constant correction. Unlike the smooth computer-assisted approaches typical in modern aviation, this landing would be entirely manual, relying on raw pilot skill. Engine 2 showing power fluctuation, Chen reported tensely, thrust decreasing by approximately 15%. Hayes adjusted instantly, compensating for the changing power distribution while maintaining their approach path. Noted, prepare for potential full loss of engine 2 during final approach. The deteriorating weather compounded their challenges. Snow reduced visibility, while gusting crosswinds threatened to push the already difficult-to-control aircraft off its precise approach path. The St. John's runway, shorter than those typically used by Boeing 777s, left little margin for error. At 5 miles from touchdown, Hayes made a decision that would later be analyzed in countless aviation safety reviews. Rather than following the standard ILS approach path, which would bring them over populated areas of St. John's, he opted for a steeper descent that would keep them over water until the last possible moment, a precaution in case the aircraft's tenuous mechanical situation deteriorated further. St. John's approach, Transglobal 257 modifying approach path, will intercept final approach at 3 miles, steeper than standard gradient. Hayes informed the controller. There was a brief pause before the controller responded. Transglobal 257, that approach path is not approved for your aircraft type. Acknowledged. St. John's, it's approved by the pilot in command given current emergency conditions. Hayes replied with the quiet authority that had once characterized his military leadership. What followed was a master class in extreme aviation. Hayes flew the crippled aircraft with a combination of technical precision and intuitive feel that transcended standard pilot training. Each gust of wind, each power fluctuation in the compromised engines, each moment of aerodynamic instability was met with immediate, precise correction. 2 miles to threshold, Chen called out, his voice tight with tension. Engine 3 now fluctuating as well. Hayes acknowledged without comment, his complete focus on maintaining the precise flight path that would bring them safely to the runway. The aircraft bucked and yawed in the turbulent air, requiring constant control inputs that would have exhausted most pilots. As they descended through 500 feet, the runway lights became visible through the swirling snow, a narrow strip of civilization in the darkness of the North Atlantic night. The emergency vehicles lined both sides of the runway, their lights casting red and blue reflections on the snow-covered surface. Transglobal 257, winds now gusting to 32 knots, 40 degrees off runway heading, the tower controller advised. For most commercial pilots, these conditions alone would constitute a serious challenge. For Hayes, managing them while handling a triple engine failure with makeshift repairs made it perhaps the most demanding landing of his career, including his combat missions. At 200 feet above the runway, Engine 3 failed completely, leaving them with a single partially functioning engine on the opposite wing, a configuration that would normally make controlled flight impossible. Engine 3 lost, Chen reported urgently. Chase responded with immediate control adjustments, using rudder, aileron, and differential spoilers to counteract the catastrophic thrust asymmetry. The aircraft banked sharply before Hayes brought it back to level, now flying essentially sideways to counteract the uneven thrust. 50 feet, Chen called out, abandoning standard protocols to provide Hayes with the information he most needed. The 777 crossed the runway threshold in a configuration that defied conventional aerodynamics. Crabbed significantly against the wind, one engine providing irregular thrust, the aircraft's massive frame fighting both physics and the storm. With precise timing, Hayes executed a maneuver that combined a decrab flare and thrust reduction in one fluid motion. The main landing gear touched down with a force that tested the airframe's structural limits, but remained intact. Reverse thrust inoperative, Chen called out as Hayes deployed the thrust reversers with no effect. Using differential braking, Hayes responded calmly, applying asymmetric brake pressure to keep the aircraft centered on the runway despite the crosswind and irregular deceleration. For the passengers and cabin crew, the landing was undeniably rough, far from the gentle touchdown typical of commercial flights. But as the aircraft's speed decreased and control was maintained, the enormity of what Hayes had accomplished became clear. What had seemed an unsurvivable catastrophe hours earlier had ended with a safe landing. As the aircraft finally came to a stop, emergency vehicles immediately surrounded them. Inside the cockpit, Hayes methodically worked through the shutdown checklist, as if they had just completed a routine flight. St. John's Tower, Transglobal 257 clear of active runway, requesting emergency vehicles maintain position for passenger evacuation. Hayes transmitted. Only after ensuring that the immediate safety protocols were complete did Hayes turn to Chen, whose expression reflected the astonishment felt by everyone aware of what had just occurred. "Captain," Chen said simply, "that was..." Hayes nodded once, the slightest break in his professional demeanor revealing the intense concentration the landing had required. "Let's get our passengers safely off the aircraft first, officer, then we can discuss the technical aspects." Federal Aviation Administration Headquarters, Washington, D.C. 6 weeks later, the hearing room fell silent as Robert Hayes concluded his testimony. For nearly 3 hours, he had methodically described the events aboard Flight 257, explaining in technical detail the unprecedented system failure and his unconventional response. His presentation had been precise, authoritative, and entirely devoid of self-congratulation, focusing solely on the technical and procedural aspects that might benefit aviation safety. At the panel table, representatives from the FAA, National Transportation Safety Board, Boeing, and international aviation authorities exchanged glances that conveyed a shared assessment. What they had just heard described one of the most extraordinary feats of airmanship in commercial aviation history. "Captain Hayes," began the NTSB chairwoman after a moment, "our technical analysis confirms your account in every detail. The complete failure of the computerized fuel management system you experienced was previously considered theoretically possible, but practically unsurvivable." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "The procedure you implemented has now been thoroughly analyzed by Boeing engineers. They've confirmed it will be incorporated into emergency training protocols for all similar aircraft." East nodded once, maintaining the same professional composure he had displayed throughout. "I appreciate that, Madam Chairwoman. If other flight crews can benefit from our experience, that's the most important outcome." The Transglobal Airlines CEO, seated in the front row, leaned forward slightly. His company had spent the weeks since the incident managing a delicate balance, celebrating the miraculous outcome, while carefully investigating how such a catastrophic system failure had occurred. "Captain Hayes," the FAA administrator interjected, "I think it's important to acknowledge explicitly what this investigation has confirmed. Your actions aboard Flight 257 saved 347 lives in a situation that our best technical experts believed was not survivable. The combination of technical knowledge, flying skill, and decision-making you demonstrated was extraordinary." For the first time in the proceedings, Hayes appeared slightly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Throughout his career, both military and civilian, he had focused on competence rather than recognition. First Officer Chen, who had been seated nearby throughout the hearing, chose this moment to speak up. "If I may add something to the record, sir." After receiving a nod from the chairman, he continued, "What the technical analysis doesn't fully capture is the environment in which Captain Hayes implemented these solutions. The aircraft was in an uncontrolled descent over open ocean in night conditions. The manual bypass procedure required physical access to systems never meant to be reached in flight, all while monitoring aircraft control, managing communications, and preparing for possible ditching. I've reviewed the simulator recreations, and they don't convey the true difficulty of what he accomplished." Hayes glanced at his former co-pilot with a mixture of surprise and appreciation. Since the incident, Chen had become an unexpected advocate, consistently redirecting attention to Hayes' actions rather than accepting recognition for his own significant contributions during the emergency. The hearing continued with technical questions about specific aspects of the incident, which Hayes answered with characteristic precision. As the session finally concluded, the panel chairwoman made a final statement that transformed what had begun as a technical investigation into something more significant. "Before we close today's proceedings, I want to note for the record that the FAA, in consultation with the Air Force Review Board, has formally submitted a recommendation regarding the Riverside incident that led to Captain Hayes' military separation 3 years ago." Hayes stiffened slightly, unprepared for this unexpected direction. "Based on evidence uncovered during this investigation, including previously unavailable data and expert testimony, we have recommended that the Air Force case be reopened for full review," she continued. "Our preliminary assessment indicates that Captain Hayes' decision-making during that incident, which was deemed recklessly endangering at the time, may have in fact been the only viable option given conditions that were not fully understood during the original investigation." For Hayes, this statement represented something he had stopped allowing himself to hope for: the possibility of professional redemption and the restoration of a reputation built over decades of exemplary service. As the hearing adjourned, Hayes was approached by a group he hadn't noticed sitting in the back of the room. 3 Air Force officers in formal uniform, including General William Davidson, his former commanding officer. "Robert," Davidson said quietly, extending his hand. The review board has been watching these proceedings with great interest. We have a lot to discuss about Riverside. Hayes accepted the handshake, emotions carefully controlled beneath his professional exterior. General, I'm available at your convenience. I think now would be appropriate, Davidson replied. We've kept you waiting for answers far too long. As Hayes prepared to follow the officers, he was stopped briefly by TransGlobal's CEO, Michael Harrington. Captain, Harrington said, I wanted to inform you personally before the public announcement. The board has unanimously approved creating a new position, Director of Flight Safety and Emergency Procedure Development. We'd like you to consider taking the role. Hayes processed this offer, a significant promotion that would allow him to transform his experience into training that could benefit countless future pilots. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harrington. May I have some time to consider it? Of course, the CEO replied. But I should mention, the position would include maintaining your active flight status. What you demonstrated on Flight 257 isn't something that should be confined to a classroom or simulator. As Hayes followed the Air Force officers to a private conference room, First Officer Chen caught his eye briefly, giving him a respectful nod that conveyed more than words could express. From the broken pilot to the man who had accomplished the impossible, Hayes' journey had come full circle. In the months that followed, the story of TransGlobal Flight 257 became a central case study in aviation training worldwide. The emergency procedure Hayes had improvised was refined, documented, and incorporated into flight manuals for similar aircraft, potentially saving countless future lives. The Air Force Review Board's reinvestigation of the Riverside incident ultimately vindicated Hayes' original decision-making, resulting in a formal reversal of the court-martial findings. For Robert Hayes, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the public recognition or professional restoration, though both were significant. It was the knowledge that when faced with what experts had deemed an unsurvivable situation, he had drawn on every aspect of his training and experience to find a solution where none was thought to exist. The journey from decorated combat pilot to disgraced officer to commercial aviator had ultimately led to his finest moment, not in combat or military triumph, but in the quiet competence that had saved 347 lives on a stormy night over the North Atlantic. If this incredible story of redemption and extraordinary airmanship captured your imagination, hit that subscribe button to join our growing community. Have you ever seen someone written off as a failure completely redeem themselves in a moment of crisis? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and would love to hear your stories. Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance to prove their true abilities? Let us know. And don't forget to turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you never miss our daily uploads of inspiring true stories that remind us heroes often come from the most unexpected places.